Why is Optus buying budget telco amaysim?
And what does open banking mean for Australians?
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.
Hi there, and welcome to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the weekly podcast where pretty soon we won't have to sneak across the state borders to catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists and get the stories behind the tech news of the week. I'm Alex Kidman, and I'm joined, as always, by Adam Turner, a man who got a much-needed day off for some kind of ritual of horse abuse this week. I don't really understand it. Adam, how goes it south of the border?
It goes well. I ventured out into the sunshine and did sweet stuff all, which is living the dream when you're a Melburnian.
Isn't it sweet stuff all with a coffee in your hand, though?
Well, that
Isn't
too.
that like
Actually, one
mandatory?
in each hand, or else you get deported and they send you to New South Wales, and God, no one wants that.
Definitely not. Definitely not. We're also joined this week once again by Finder Editor-in-Chief Angus Kidman. Gus, in hindsight, do you feel that you might have left your run at the US presidency just a little bit late this time around?
Look, there was a clear family agreement. Nicole goes first, then me.
Hard to argue with that. Hard to argue with that. Now, Optus has had a busy week announcing it's going to launch its own budget virtual telco, GOMO, into Australia, and at the same time that it's buying out leading MVNO, amaysim.
So we'll dive into what that means for Australian mobile plans shortly, but first, let's talk moolah, and especially this new tech initiative called Open Banking, which is making it easier for Australians to manage their finances. To do that, we caught up earlier with finder.com.au's global fintech editor, Liz Barry. Hi Liz, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, open banking is something we've been hearing about for a while, and it's just actually starting to come to fruition. But what actually is it? Like, not in terms of the technology and the plumbing in the background, but why, as a consumer, should I care about this thing called open banking?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, open banking is basically a secure and simple way for you to share your financial data to companies to get benefits and products that you want.
Okay, and so what are some examples of how I might want to use that?
Yeah, a great example is budgeting apps. So, right now with budgeting apps, you either have to do some kind of roundabout way to let them access your bank details, or you have to upload your financial statements manually. With open banking, you won't have to do that. Basically, the banking app and your bank will talk to each other securely so that you can just get the benefit of having all of your financial data read by the banking app in a really safe way.
And so if I had two different bank accounts with two different banks and they both supported this, I could bring both their data into the one app into the same view, a bit way like with a calendar, I can see multiple calendars in the same view all at the same time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's basically all the banks are going to be taking part in this, and you can use it however you like. So that's definitely a way to use it.
Yeah.
So when you say data, though, what we're actually talking about here is, unless I'm very much mistaken, we're talking like financial transaction details. We're not talking about money transfers, are we?
So there's different types of financial data that are going to be brought in at different stages. So right now, credit and debit card transaction data is able to be looked at through open banking, and eventually they'll get into personal loan and mortgage data.
So as a Melburnian, if I was using a banking app, I could look at my banking details and see how much I'm spending on coffee each week and make some suggestions.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the budgeting app, but there's definitely budgeting apps that allow you to do that, and
Yeah,
open banking will just facilitate that.
cool.
How does this work, if we know at all, between the banks? Because my understanding is like the whole open banking thing, it's absolutely mandatory for like the big four banks, and then some other smaller banks will come on board in the future. But how does it work kind of shifting between them? Can they shift your data? Do you have to give permission? Because I can imagine people being a little bit worried about that kind of privacy angle of it.
Oh, for sure. I mean, privacy and security were a massive thing. That's why it took so long to get rolled out. They really wanted to get that right. But basically, there's two types of companies and institutions that are involved in open banking. One type is a data holder, so that would be your bank that holds your financial data, and the other type is an accredited data recipient. So that's basically a company that says, that's the budgeting app. They're basically saying, hey, we want consumers to be able to securely transfer their data to us. They have to prove that they can hold it securely and, meet all different kinds of privacy regulations. And once they do that, they become accredited.
If we'll say I'm with the ANZ and I've also got an account with the Commonwealth Bank, it doesn't let each bank see what I'm doing with the other bank. It's not that kind of data sharing, is it? It just lets me bring in those data sources and then mix them together and do interesting things or share them with someone who I choose to share.
Exactly. It's all up to what you want to do with it. So
Yeah.
if you want to transfer your data from bank A to company A, then you can as well. Banks can't kind of look at each other's data just because it's part of this ecosystem.
Yeah.
But presumably, then there'd be a scenario where if I had a mortgage with a bank, uh, without using brand names, if I had a mortgage with Bank A, and I thought, I'm not sure if I want to refinance, I could more easily, I guess, tell banks B, C, and D, hey, this is what I'm currently paying, this is what I'm doing, make me an offer. Is it that kind of
Yeah,
thinking?
yes, that's right. So a huge part of open banking was to kind of instill a bit of competition between Australia's banks. So if it's easier for consumers to kind of compare and find options that are better for them, and also switch, they're hoping that banks will get a bit more innovative.
Now, am I right in thinking that this can actually help you switch? Because if you decide you want to move from Bank A to Bank B, you can get them to transfer your information via this. So it's just like, it got easier to port telcos to move your phone number or to move your internet. It's now going to be easier to move banks because you can say, look, just take everything I do with you and transfer it over to them. And even I think take all the direct debits I've got set up with you and automatically transfer it over to them so I don't have to set everything up again.
Yeah, so that might be coming down the track, but right now, the only option that banks and data holders have is they only have access for write access, which read access. It basically means that they can only view the data that you want them to see.
Yeah.
What they would need to kind of do what you're talking about is write access, which would allow them to, move things about in your account and kind of shift it over. So that actually hasn't been approved in open banking yet.
But I can imagine how that would really open up competition. For example, with my bank, I've got my personal banking and my home loan and my credit cards, but I've also got my business bank account because I've got a business. So if I wanted to change banks, having to move all of that would be an absolute nightmare. And so I'm like, well, I guess I'm just going to have to live with Bank A and whatever rubbish they throw at me. But that ability to port all that stuff across and get all the connections to move with it is really going to encourage me to sit down and go, well, maybe Bank B is better because it's not going to take me 2 weeks of stuffing around to change.
Yeah, exactly. And what you said before about, the portability of kind of phone numbers and phone accounts and things like that, that's
Yeah.
what people are hoping to happen with this open banking. So if, right access comes in, then the switching aspect of this will become so much easier.
So the banks themselves, certainly the big banks, have to be part of this. It's mandated. Do consumers opt in? Are they just automatically in this standard now? Do they have to do anything particular?
Consumers don't have to do anything if they don't want to. Basically, it's just optional for people. So you're right. So the big banks are all taking part now. There's also a timeline for the other banks to come on board. But basically, if you want no part of this, you don't have to have any part of this. But if you start using a new product or service or a current one, and you're like, oh, maybe I'd like to, use my financial data to kind of get a new product or find out a personalized offer or see if I can save somewhere, then you can definitely take part of this if your bank has made it available just yet.
And when we say bank, are we meaning bank? Do credit unions, do neobanks, do all these other different kind of financial institutions also qualify for open banking?
Yes, they do. So basically, right now, the big four banks and the other financial institutions have been given different timelines. So the big four banks had to do it first, and it was sort of a 12-month delay for credit unions, smaller banks, all those kind of banks to come into play.
So they have to do it as well. By this time next year, they'll any bank of any description will have to offer this.
Yeah, that's right. It's they kind of wanted to make it a really flat landscape with open banking and make sure that any consumer, no matter who they banked with, could take part in it if they wanted.
So we've seen this overseas, haven't we? We're not the first country in the world to do this.
No, we're definitely not. So the UK actually started doing this. It was a couple of years ago, maybe. Oh no, it really came in at the beginning of this year, and you've seen quite a few apps offer, open banking services and things like that, and bank switching services and other options like that have been available in countries for a little while as well.
What's the most innovative thing you've seen people do with open banking or fintech? Oh, because imagine there's lots of startups coming up with all these crazy ideas of what they could do with this.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of people are kind of seeing the possibilities of open banking at the moment. Even in the UK, where open banking is even currently available, we're kind of just seeing the beginnings of what it can be. So a lot of that is budgeting apps. It's giving people personalized offers, things like that. There have been a lot of big dreams for companies to offer open banking with some really cool product ideas and services.
And this all broadly plays into, I believe it's called the consumer data right. This idea that an awful lot of this kind of quite valuable, quite useful information might be tradable, I believe, across other areas, in the coming years.
Yeah, that's right. So that's actually one place that we differ from the UK. So when the UK rolled this out, they literally just rolled out open banking. What Australia has done is created this consumer data right, which means that open banking, so finance is the first sector that it's going to apply to, but they're actually going to do different sectors after this. So the next sector for this kind of open data, idea to apply to is energy.
Now, energy's already gone a little bit that way. If you look at, because I got solar installed a couple of years ago, and I know that I can go to my distributor and download a spreadsheet of how much power I've used on 15-minute increments over the last 6 months, and all this data that you never would have thought you'd be able to get before. So I can crunch the numbers and see how my solar panels are working. I would imagine that consumer data right will extend that considerably. The kind of things you could do with looking at your power and alternative power sources and whether you're saving money.
Yeah, definitely. So the example you just gave, that's awesome that you can already do that, but it's obviously quite a manual process. I
Oh
can't
yeah, I
see.
came up with
Yeah.
some funky spreadsheets to make that happen. It's pretty ugly.
Yeah,
Actually, I lie.
exactly.
My neighbour's an accountant. I call him Captain Spreadsheet. I pinched his spreadsheets and modified them because it was just, that kind of Excel kung fu is just above my pay grade.
Yeah, exactly. So it's quite it maybe above quite a few people's pay grades, and the effort involved. You can't really expect every consumer to do that.
Yeah.
So hopefully, when this is applied to the energy sector, it's just going to make it really easy. And not only that, but maybe open the door for a lot of different products and services to make finding new energy deals and switching a lot easier.
And hopefully actually just understanding them. Because I think a lot of people are reluctant to switch energy providers just because they look at, this feed in tariff and that tariff and where their off peak is and whether or not they get a solar. Like it gets very complicated very,
Yeah.
very quickly. I would imagine having this kind of open data sharing would make it a fair bit easier for companies that want your business to pitch to you to say, hey, we can make this easier. This is what you're going to pay.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that again applies to so many different sectors. People don't often understand the financial products they have. Home loans and things can get quite complicated. Insurance, all those kind of aspects can get very complicated with those products. So with this, hopefully, it will allow for companies to come out with simplified, solutions to help consumers really understand what they're getting and find good deals.
I guess if you're granting them that access to historical data, then rather than saying, "Oh, we reckon we could save you, $200 a year or whatever," they could look at your exact data, whether it's your power usage or your gas usage or your superannuation, and say, judging on your data, if you'd been with us in the last 12 months on this plan, you would have saved exactly this amount of money. I would imagine that's a pretty compelling argument to get people to change.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not only good for, switching products, but also just like proving value in
Yeah.
companies' products. That's a kind of like competitiveness that is hoping to be kind of like instilled with this. Yeah, I think if you haven't heard of open banking, it's not on you. It's still very new. So just wait to see what products and services come out under open banking, and then decide if you want to use it.
Great. Well, thanks very much for joining us on the show.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
And Liz,
Yeah.
if people want to find you on social media, how do they do that?
So you can go to my Twitter. So it's twitter.com/the Elizabeth.
Fantastic. And as it's an election week, we're also polling. What's your vote for the best biscuit?
Oh, the best biscuit. Oh, that's a good one. I want to say Monte Carlo.
Ooh, controversial.
Classy.
Classy, but controversial.
Thank you.
So I don't know if we're having elections for the worst name of a product in 2020, but Gomo has to be up there, surely.
Well, Gomo, for those who aren't aware, is actually an existing brand name. And
Really?
to give this some context, this week Optus announced that it's launching Gomo into Australia, and Optus's parent company Singtel runs Gomo as a kind of youth-centric, cheap and simple MVNO in Singapore and Indonesia and a couple of other places, I believe. Isn't that right, Gus?
Yeah, that's right. So, look, in some ways, it's very much, you can look at it a bit as the Boost of Southeast Asia. Like, that's the
Okay.
brand. I agree with Adam. It sounds like an off-brand Hobbit. It's not great.
I think he was one of the Fraggles, wasn't he?
That was Gobo as well.
He was the chef of Fraggles. We hardly knew him.
Optus really only announced, hey, we're going to bring Gomo to the local market. They didn't announce much else, did they?
No, we have no details other than they've said it's going to be a digital first kind of brand. So the notion is you'll interact with it through an app. You won't be ringing a call center. It'll be cheaper to run. That's potentially great. It's also potentially horrible because any brand that's gone down that path, and we've seen this a lot in the telco space, if something goes wrong that the app can't sort out, your wait to get to that call center is even longer and even harder. So I think that's always a double-edged sword, but it's definitely the way that if you're a telco who's trying to think, how do I cut costs? That's what you do.
Yeah, I went and had a look actually at what Gomo does in Singapore, obviously Singtel's home base, but even that's not terribly instructional in terms of how they're going to manage stuff because there the plans are still predicated on, look, here's a quantity of data, and sure, you get that here, but here's a quantity of calling minutes and texts. And the simple reality is outside the POOG space, everyone, I mean everyone, just does unlimited calls and texts now, don't they?
Absolutely. There's no sale to be had in saying, hey, we've got amazingly cheap rates for your calls because that ceiling has disappeared and you can get free calls for like half a year for incredibly low money if you don't want much data. So whatever they do will have to be different with that. And if you're going to be youth oriented, it's all about the data because I think the kids are hanging around on these TikTok things. I don't know how any of that works, but apparently data is quite important for it.
So before we get to amaysim, why is this just to appeal to the kids? Because Telstra has the Belong brand as well. Is that because Telstra is the brand that your grandmother signs up for, so no one wants to be with Telstra? Like, what's the thinking there?
Yeah, it's about diversity in both cases. This notion that actually the major brands in Australia are extraordinarily successful and they have a huge chunk of the market in their own right. But there's always a slice of people you can get who've had a bad experience with a brand who just think like they don't want to work with that and who you might be able to bring in. So if you can do it cheaply and you can effectively claim some more of that market space, it's still a little bit more effective for you potentially than the alternative of saying, well, I'll just wholesale some of my available spectrum to other people and let them do what they want with it. So, and it's a strategy that has, worked relatively well for brands over time. So it's not surprising that Optus will have a go at it. It doesn't necessarily mean it'll work, of course. And let's remember that Optus has been down this road before because Optus owned Virgin Mobile in Australia. Ran that as quite a big successful competitor for a while, and then eventually said, no, this isn't working for us and gave up on it.
Mm.
Virgin was a little different. I mean, Virgin was the youth. You're not wrong. Virgin was the youth Optus brand, but obviously Virgin also did contract phones and they had stores and they did all these things that they're not presumably going to do with Gomo unless it becomes some huge success. I guess the other question though is Optus is pretty much the biggest wholesaler for MVNOs for virtual operators in Australia. Gus, why would they want not one but in fact two in-house MVNOs when you're already selling your product off to so many other suppliers anyway?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because you would start going, right, how much diversity do you need within one space before it really becomes a little bit troublesome? You can see them as going at different spaces. So you can say Domo could be very much, it's entirely youth focused. It's literally going to be digital only. It'll be very hard to get a SIM anyway, other than in the post. You could really shrink that. Whereas amaysim is a big brand. It has massive retail presence. It's quite well known in a broader sphere. So, but I think this, inevitably lead into the amaysim thing. When you say, why does Optus want to buy out amaysim, which uses the Optus network and is therefore a source of revenue for it anyway? If amaysim does well, Optus gets some money. I think one of the reasons there might be that it had become apparent that amaysim, as a separate company, was starting to look at, will we stick with Optus? They put out a statement about a month, 6 weeks ago, where they said, we're going to look at looking at our wholesale deal, so we're not necessarily sticking at who we've got right now. amaysim has been with Optus the entire time it's operated in this market. And so there could be a point where, obviously, that means amaysim's exploring this option, and maybe Optus goes, well, hang on, are we better off guaranteeing that revenue from the wholesaler by owning it? Whereas because the realistic alternative, and I have no insight into what they might have done, but there's a good chance they might have said, hey, we'll have a look at going with Telstra. And then
or do you
Optus
think they only said that because they knew a sale was on the cards and they were just trying to force the hand?
There's a little of column A, a little of column B. Don't know. But the fact that statement came out and then suddenly there's a buyout coming, what it does tell you unequivocally is that the amaysim board was saying, right, we have to look at an exit strategy now. That they've done well. They are the largest independent MVNO by any measure anyone looks at. They've done really well to get to that. But as a listed company, they're doing that shareholdery thing and saying, well, we just have to look at, well, is this a way we can maximize return for our shareholders? And it might have become apparent that even being a successful MVNO is not the best model you can be in, especially because amaysim had this vision that they were going to do more than just sell mobile plans. And I can remember, as one of the 3 old men on this podcast, I can remember interviewing those guys when they started, before they'd even actually launched. And even then they had this vision that, well, if this does well, we won't just sell mobile plans, we'll go into other things. They tried that, and it's fair to say, as a business, it did not work. They tried going into broadband, selling NBN. That didn't happen. They ended up selling off their customers from that to Southern Phone, I think. And then they tried going into energy, and they've sold out of that as well. They haven't managed to make that transition. So you might go, well, if this is as big and as valuable as the business gets, if we can be very successful in mobile, but in a market that's not growing very much, and Australia really isn't growing very much, and our population is going to grow even less over the next few years, as a responsible ASX-focused shareholder, CEO guy, you're going to go, right, well, what I'm doing is work out how can I make the most money, and that's probably by trying to sell yourself off. And if Optus are the ones who put up their hands to do that, then from your shareholder point of view, that's a good outcome.
But they're not going to have shareholders for that much longer, because once they've sold their mobile business, they're actually going to wind the whole business up.
Oh, totally. But the point is they get the return on that. The people who invest in that get some money back out of that, whereas their future otherwise was a little bit uncertain. And yes, it will stop existing as an independent business. Optus has said it will keep the brand on. It hasn't said we're going to close it. That doesn't mean that's true forever. Probably means it's true for the next couple of years.
Isn't the other angle to this, though, that Telstra, as we've mentioned, has Belong, and while Boost is independent, it seems to have some kind of special status with Telstra. Vodafone, as part of the TPG group, has lots of its own little sub-brands, and Optus, up until this week, really didn't have any. Is this just a consolidation play? And what does that mean in terms of competition in this space for Australian consumers?
Look, the market is shrinking a little bit in this space, and this has been the case for a while, because it's been hard for really small MVNOs to make a go of it. Bear in mind that amaysim itself bought out 2 of the larger other competitors, Via and Genic. This consolidation has been going on for a while. It has always been, it's been the case, certainly as long as I've been covering this stuff, that the best value in terms of outright data has always come from the MVNOs. You've always got a better deal, and this is where amaysim had always done well. They always had a generous data allowance. They put it up really regularly, and they moved all their existing customers onto it really regularly, which is something a lot of brands don't do. They'll put better offers in, but you have to actually fight to get onto them. So I think they'd identified a good space there, and continuing that will probably be crucial to Optus keeping those amaysim customers on, because if they don't do that and if it starts looking bad, it's easy to switch plans now. There are plenty of other Optus-based MVNOs, and people who want to switch will start switching. So it's hard to work out. We shouldn't discount the possibility that you had 2 parallel things going on that, a bit annoyingly for Optus, have hit at the same time. That on the one hand, you said, right, we're going to launch Gomo. We know about this. It's tied in with our parent company. We're doing that. Then suddenly it's like amaysim going, oh, well, hey, we're thinking maybe we're going to go after someone else, or maybe you'd like to buy us. And they just happen to have made the 2 decisions around the same time. It's not necessarily a well thought out strategy. It might just be events landing at a point that maybe no one predicted. But because in both cases listed companies are involved, once it looks like it's going to happen, you do have to make that disclosure. You do have to tell the public that's what you're up to.
I do wonder about that value proposition, though, because I do a lot of research and writing around this myself, of course, as well. And it leaves a pretty short list of those high data value MVNOs. I mean, right now, in fact, another Singaporean-based telco, Circles Life, is seemingly burning a lot of cash with really, really big data plans. But if you put them as an outlier, everyone else in that space that isn't owned by the networks, their plans are getting really quite small. Like there's not as much competition out there, and it does concern me for those people who are looking for a better value plan that they're just not going to have as much choice out there. If you're just buying a amaysim, but it's basically just Optus, in the same way actually as we've seen, to be fair, with TPG, with all of the brands it's bought, all of their mobile plans are basically the same these days.
Exactly. And, with their TPG is the textbook case of how you can maintain brands for other reasons, but the product becomes identical. And it will be interesting to see how this splits out. And Optus, in its own right, isn't the worst value for data by a long shot. It's okay. It's not as good as most of its MVNOs, but it generally is more generous than Telstra, and it's often on par with Vodafone. So there'll still be some things there, but I think it will be interesting to see what happens, because you then have a lot of the MVNOs then end up in these weird specialty markets. So you still have brands like Labara who are still around, but they're still very much about international calling. Data's still a bit of a throw on as far as that goes. You have other people who are really focusing on, hey, we'll offer you lots and lots of home 3G, but it'll be 3G at best. And it might drop to, I can't drop to 2G anymore, but it can certainly be fairly poor 3G. And there's those, it's a very fragmented market now, and there probably won't be so many headline hogging, wow, here's an amazing data offer that lasts for a long time. And I guess for consumers, if you want to do this well, you'll be porting a lot more often.
Well, speaking of the Gs, actually, one of the things they did say about Gomo, which surprised me as a prepaid, and I guess they could do this with a amaysim as well, is that they said Gomo will have access to Optus 5G. And so far, there aren't any prepaid providers on Optus 5G. I think it's Spintel, off the top of my head, has Optus 5G, but it's only in a post-paid environment, not as a prepaid competitor. Gus, do you think that's actually going to matter, for any appreciable length of time?
Not right now, because a point that has been made frequently on this podcast is that 5G is not necessarily something that is a massive selling point for most people right now, unless you happen to have been lucky and you're living in an apartment building and they built a tower on the top of it. It's not that big a selling point for most people. So I think historically that's been an important distinguishing point, that if you're the main brand, you say, hey, we've got 5G and the other guys haven't got it. But it's the same thing. It's like, well, how bad am I finding my 4G experience now anyway? Am I genuinely feeling like that would be the thing that I want to go for? So I think, eventually this will trickle down to them. There might be some differentiation. There often has been. But right now, if your focus is saying, well, I want to get a decently sized data plan on a network I can receive, 5G is not your focus.
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Gus for joining us for the show. So now is the time for Gus for you to plug your publication, your social media accounts, and your vote for the best biscuit. Go.
All right, so my publication is finder.com.au. You can find me on Twitter at GusWorldAU, and the best biscuit, unquestionably, is the original and still extant and still unchallenged barbecue shape.
Ooh, controversial call there.
I'm thinking sweet biscuit. You didn't specify the kind of biscuit.
I was going to go the iced Vovo myself. I'm a bit of a traditionalist, but the barbecue shape is a mighty, mighty fine contender there.
Yes. Had you said sweet, I think I probably would have been in iced Vovo territory as well. But, biscuits is a broad category and we accept all comers.
We do not discriminate against biscuits here. And while we're not discriminating against biscuits, you can also catch us online at Vertical Hold AU on Twitter, at verticalhold.com.au on the web, or on the Vertical Hold Facebook page. And that's what they call a smooth segue.
Thanks for tuning in once again in what's been a bit of a crazy week. We appreciate you making the time to drop by. Leave us a review on your podcasting platform of choice and help us spread the good word. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. They're all selling the socialist worker. They make me march down the back and sell the TV Times. I've always liked that line.